You people never learn, do you? The officer's voice dripped with condescension, his grip tightening as he yanked her arms behind her back with unnecessary force. The cold bite of metal wrapped around her wrists as the handcuffs clicked into place. The sound echoed in the vast courtroom, yet no one flinched. No one moved. It was as if the scene unfolding before them was nothing more than routine, another black woman taken down, another case that wouldn't make it past the evening news. She could feel their eyes on her. Dozens of them. Some filled with amusement, others with indifference. But none with concern. Not for her. A thick silence spread through the room, a suffocating weight of judgment pressing against her skin. The walls of the courtroom, adorned with symbols of so-called justice, felt like they were closing in, shrinking, suffocating, trapping her in this moment of humiliation. The only sounds breaking the stillness were the whispers, murmurs exchanged between the spectators, low enough to seem discreet but loud enough to be intentional. She really thought she could get away with it. Typical. Always playing the victim. She should have known better. The judge sat perched behind his towering desk, a symbol of authority, yet his expression was one of boredom. His gavel rested lazily in his fingers, tapping against the wooden surface in a slow, rhythmic pattern, as if he were merely waiting for the theatrics to end so he could deliver the inevitable conclusion. His eyes barely lifted to meet hers. She had seen this before. Felt this before. The sensation of being reduced to nothing in the eyes of people who saw her as less than. The scripted performance of injustice playing out in real time. The system doing exactly what it was built to do. And yet, she remained standing. Not because she wasn't hurt. Not because she wasn't furious. But because she refused to give them what they wanted, fear. Submission. Defeat. The prosecutor stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he approached the jury. He was middle-aged, dressed in a tailored navy suit that screamed prestige and arrogance. He carried a stack of papers in one hand, his other gesturing dramatically as he spoke, his voice coated in false certainty. This woman, he began, pausing deliberately for effect, was caught in possession of stolen property. He lifted a sheet of paper, waving it slightly before placing it on the evidence table. She was seen on security footage. We have multiple witnesses. Signed statements. And yet, he turned slightly, his gaze landing on her, eyes filled with disdain. She insists she's innocent. That this is some kind of mistake. A misunderstanding. His lips curled into a smirk. Tell me, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how many times have we heard that before? Laughter rippled through the room. Quiet, but sharp enough to cut. The officer behind her let out a chuckle, shaking his head. They always say that. She felt her stomach tighten. Not in fear. Not in panic. But in rage. They were mocking her. In front of her. Confident in the knowledge that nothing would happen to them. That no one would stand up and call this what it was. That no one would care. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her hands curling into fists against the cold cuffs. The judge let out a sigh, finally straightening his posture, as if he had been inconvenienced by the formalities of the trial. Enough theatrics, he muttered, shifting his gaze toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his decision had been made long before she ever walked through those courtroom doors. We have seen the evidence. The prosecution has made a compelling case. And quite frankly, I see no reason to prolong this any further. Her chest tightened. Not in fear. Not in surprise. But in frustration. Because she had seen this before. The mechanical, soulless way justice was denied. The orchestrated performance of authority. The illusion of fairness. She had been tried before the trial even started. She scanned the room. The jury, 12 faces carefully selected to make sure this case had only one outcome. The spectators, some eager, some indifferent, none concerned. The reporters, scribbling furiously, recording the fall of another black woman, another headline that would justify the system's cruelty. And then there were the officers. Lined up at the back, arms folded, watching with quiet satisfaction. Watching her lose. The judge tapped his gavel lightly against the desk. A soft, almost mocking gesture. And for these reasons, he continued, voice void of any real emotion, I find the defendant, but she wasn't listening anymore. Not to him. Not to any of them. Because they thought this was the moment she would break. They thought this was the moment she would lower her head, let the shame settle into her bones, and accept the truth they had crafted for her. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had humiliated her. Disrespected her. Dehumanized her in front of an entire courtroom. But what would they do, what could they do, when they realized that the woman they had just sentenced wasn't just another black woman caught in the system? What would they do when they learned that the woman they had just falsely accused, mocked, and dismissed was one of the highest-ranking intelligence officers in the country? That the very person they had so carelessly tossed into the flames of their injustice was someone who knew every single one of their secrets? The courtroom thought they had won. But the game had just begun. And when the truth came out, the world would watch them crumble. Would justice finally be served? Or would the system try to bury the truth before it could destroy everything? Stay until the end. Because what happens next will leave you speechless. Hey, family. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and any form of injustice. We know the struggles, the pain, and the reality of being judged unfairly just for the color of our skin. But we also know our power, our resilience, and our worth. This story is more than just fiction, it's a reflection of real struggles that too many of us face. But remember, truth and justice always have their way of coming to light. Keep your head high, stay strong, and never let anyone dim your shine. Now, sit back, get ready for a ride, and enjoy the story. And hey, if you believe in justice, if you stand for truth, hit that subscribe button and be part of this movement. Let's get into it. Here's your story. The weight of the Alabama heat pressed down on Montgomery like an unshakable force, thick and suffocating, clinging to the skin of those who stood outside the courthouse. The grand building, with its tall white pillars and stone facade, had loomed over the city for decades, a symbol of authority that had never truly belonged to everyone. Outside, a crowd had gathered, their voices rising and falling in waves of anger, exhaustion, and frustration. Protesters held their signs high, their faces tight with the weight of yet another injustice playing out in plain sight. Some chanted. Others stood in silence, their presence alone a statement. They knew how this would go. They had seen it before, felt it before. The system did not bend for people like them. Inside, the atmosphere was just as heavy, though no one would admit it. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold, artificial glow casting harsh shadows across the polished wooden surfaces. The air smelled of old paper and polished oak, a sterile space where decisions were made, where lives were rewritten with the simple swing of a gavel. At the center of it all, seated at the defendant's table, was Aaliyah Carter. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, but her mind was anything but still. She could feel the stares drilling into her, the weight of assumptions pressing down like an iron hand. The jury sat rigid, a carefully selected group of individuals who had already decided her fate before she even walked through the courtroom doors. Their faces told her everything she needed to know. The blank stares. The subtle frowns. The way their gazes never lingered too long, as if looking at her for more than a second would force them to acknowledge the discomfort of their own bias. Aaliyah had spent her entire life preparing for battles she should have never had to fight. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, she had learned early on that being black meant being watched. Being underestimated. Being questioned at every turn. She had spent her childhood pushing against those expectations, proving, time and time again, that she was more than the assumptions thrown at her like chains meant to keep her in place. By 20, she had already shattered records, proving herself in ways that people like her were never supposed to. She had climbed the ranks in intelligence faster than anyone expected, outthinking and outmaneuvering those who doubted her at every step. She had solved cases no one else could. She had outsmarted criminals, corrupt officials, and those who thought power meant untouchability. And yet, none of that mattered here. Here, she was not Aaliyah Carter, the decorated investigator. She was just another black woman in handcuffs. The courtroom was cold, despite the heat outside, and the prosecutor, Mark Sterling, moved with the confidence of a man who had never had to question his place in the world. His navy blue suit was flawless, his shoes shined to perfection, his entire demeanor calculated. He paced in front of the jury, gesturing smoothly as he spoke, as if this were just another performance, another script he had perfected. "This woman," he said, pausing for effect as he gestured toward Aaliyah without so much as glancing at her, was caught in possession of stolen property. The evidence is overwhelming. Surveillance footage. Witnesses. Signed testimonies. And yet, she sits here, insisting that she is the victim. He turned to face the jury directly, his voice thick with condescension. How many times have we heard that before? A few members of the jury shifted slightly in their seats, the question settling into their minds like a carefully placed seed. He smirked. It was too easy. Behind her, the officer who had cuffed her let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. They always say that. Aaliyah's fingers curled into fists against the smooth wood of the table. She could feel the pressure of the cuffs against her wrists, the sharp bite of metal digging into her skin. She could feel the weight of their laughter, their certainty, their entitlement to her silence. She let out a slow breath. Controlled. Measured. Steady. Judge Raymond Calloway, a man who had sat in that same seat for decades, exhaled impatiently, finally shifting his gaze toward her. His presence was one of authority, but not of fairness. His robe was pressed, his hands steady as they rested on the desk before him. He had seen countless trials, countless black defendants sitting exactly where she was now. And in all his years, he had rarely seen a case end any other way. He tapped his gavel lightly, the sound echoing through the chamber like a quiet warning. "Enough theatrics, Mr. Sterling," he said, though his tone carried no real reprimand. It was a formality, nothing more. He turned his attention fully to Aaliyah now, and the weight of his stare was not one of curiosity, but of finality. "We've seen the evidence," he continued, his voice firm, deliberate. "The prosecution has made a compelling case." The reporters in the back of the room scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing, capturing every second of what they assumed was the fall of another black woman. Aaliyah could hear it all. The hum of the lights. The distant clicking of a camera lens. The shuffling of papers. The quiet, expectant breathing of the jury as they waited for the inevitable. She saw the officers standing by the door, their arms folded, their expressions unreadable, but she knew what they were thinking. They had already won. She saw the prosecutor, a man who had built his entire career on cases like these, his smirk just barely contained. She saw the judge, a man who had given up on the idea of justice a long time ago. She saw them all. And they didn't see her at all. They thought this was just another case. Another black woman thrown into the machine, another name that would disappear into the system, another life rewritten to fit their narrative. But they were wrong. Because Aaliyah Carter wasn't just anyone. And when they realized who she really was, who they had just falsely accused, mocked, and sentenced, it would be too late for them to undo what they had set in motion. She had let them talk. Let them laugh. Let them believe they had won. But their time was up. And when the truth came out, they would be the ones on trial. The courtroom felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against the air itself. The murmurs had faded, replaced by a weighted silence, thick with certainty. This wasn't a trial, it was a carefully orchestrated show, a performance where the ending had been scripted before the first act had even begun. And Aaliyah Carter was expected to play her role. She sat, still as stone, her wrists bound, her eyes steady. The world around her moved in slow motion. Judge Calloway's fingers tapped against his desk, his impatience barely masked beneath a layer of feigned professionalism. Mark Sterling straightened his tie, the prosecutor's smirk lingering like a stain on the atmosphere. The jury exchanged glances, silent confirmation that their minds had already been made up. The tension was suffocating. Sterling turned back toward her, his voice smooth, almost casual, as if this was nothing more than a mild inconvenience in his day. "You know, Miss Carter, I have to give you credit. Most defendants in your position have the decency to at least look nervous." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "But you're different, aren't you? Sitting there, back straight, like you actually think this is going to end in your favor." Aaliyah didn't react. She had learned long ago that men like him fed on reactions. They thrived on the satisfaction of watching people crumble beneath their words, beneath the weight of a system that had always tilted in their favor. She wasn't going to give him that. Sterling took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough so that only she could hear. "I don't know what fantasy you've built up in your head, but let me be the first to break it for you. You're done, sweetheart. You lost the second you walked into this room." A slow breath left Aaliyah's lips. Not in fear. Not in anger. Just measured. Controlled. She had expected this, anticipated every move before it was made. Yet, they still hadn't anticipated her. Judge Calloway exhaled, adjusting his robe as if to signal his readiness to move things along. "Let's wrap this up. Ms. Carter, you have one last chance to speak before I deliver my ruling." A hush fell over the room. Even the reporters, who had been scribbling furiously into their notepads, paused, waiting. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, letting the silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, each one expecting either submission or desperation. Instead, she spoke, her voice calm, measured. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Sterling." Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "If the evidence against me is as airtight as you claim, why the need for all of this?" She gestured subtly, indicating the smugness, the arrogance, the premature celebration of a victory that hadn't yet been delivered. "If you're so certain of my guilt, why do you need to convince yourself as much as you do the jury?" Sterling's smirk faltered, just for a second. But he recovered quickly, scoffing. "Is that all you've got, Carter? No last-minute sob story? No begging for mercy? Maybe you've finally realized there isn't any left for you." Aaliyah leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Mercy isn't what I'm looking for. I just like watching you scramble when you think you have everything under control." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, maybe even unease, but it was gone just as fast. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. "Enough, Ms. Carter. I'm done with the games." "Games?" Aaliyah let the word settle in the air before a small, humorless smile touched her lips. "That's interesting, Your Honor. Because from where I'm sitting, the only ones playing games here are the people who walked into this courtroom thinking they understood exactly how today was going to go." The tension shifted. It was subtle. A change in atmosphere that only those paying attention would have noticed. The quiet confidence in her tone, the unshaken resolve in her eyes. Something in the room had shifted, a disturbance in the certainty that had filled the air just moments ago. Sterling's jaw tightened. "Enough of this. Let's get on with it." Judge Calloway nodded, raising his gavel slightly. "Very well. The court finds the defendant." The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sudden movement sent a ripple through the room. Heads turned. Whispers stirred. A uniformed officer strode in, his expression unreadable, his pace steady, purposeful. The judge frowned, clearly displeased with the interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" Calloway demanded. The officer didn't immediately respond. Instead, he made his way forward, stopping only when he reached the prosecution's table. He leaned down, whispering something into Sterling's ear. The prosecutor stiffened. For the first time all day, his confidence wavered. Aaliyah watched, unblinking, as his face paled slightly, the smug ease he had carried unraveling at the edges. His fingers curled against the surface of the table, his jaw clenching. "What?" He cleared his throat, voice lower now. "Are you sure?" The officer nodded. "Sir, I strongly suggest you take a look at this." A folder was handed over. Thick. Official. Sterling hesitated before taking it, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the contents. And then, he froze. Silence stretched through the room once more. But this time, it was different. This time, it was not one of certainty, but of suspicion. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Sterling. What is the meaning of this?" The prosecutor didn't answer immediately. His fingers gripped the edges of the file just a little too tightly. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Something was very, very wrong. Aaliyah remained still. Watching. Waiting. Then, Sterling looked at her. For the first time since the trial had begun, he truly looked at her. And she saw it. The realization creeping into his expression. The calculations running wild in his mind, piecing together a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. He licked his lips, swallowing hard before shifting his gaze back to the judge. "Your Honor, I need a recess." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The jury exchanged confused glances. Reporters tensed, their pens hovering above their notepads. Judge Calloway's frown deepened. "A recess? We're at the conclusion of the trial. What exactly are you trying to pull?" Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. And Aaliyah Carter smiled. It was small. Barely noticeable. But it was there. And he saw it. Because the moment that folder had landed in his hands, everything changed. The game he thought he had won. It had never even started. And now, it was too late to stop what was coming. The silence inside the courtroom was thick, pressing against the walls like an invisible force. Every breath felt too loud. Every movement felt too obvious. Mark Sterling still had the folder clutched in his hands, his fingers gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He was stuck between the weight of the revelation in front of him and the reality of what it meant. Judge Calloway's patience was thinning. His voice came sharp, demanding. "Mr. Sterling, explain yourself. What is in that folder?" Sterling swallowed hard. He wasn't the type of man who lost control of a courtroom, but now, standing there, exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated, the power he thought he had was slipping through his fingers like sand. He turned slowly, looking at Aaliyah. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She was just watching him, her expression unreadable. And that terrified him. Sterling exhaled, forcing his voice to steady. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you privately before proceeding further with this case." Murmurs erupted from the gallery. Confused whispers. Shuffling feet. The jury members exchanged glances, sensing that something was unraveling. The reporters tensed, their pens poised over their notepads. Judge Calloway's eyes darkened. "A private discussion? You had no problem grandstanding in front of the court a moment ago. Whatever is in that folder, you'll discuss it now." Sterling's throat worked as he clenched his jaw. He knew there was no getting out of this. His eyes flicked back to the document in his hand, scanning over the bold letters at the top. Central Intelligence Agency. He let out a shaky breath. Your Honor, there has been a significant oversight regarding the identity of the defendant. The room tensed. Even the officers in the back, who had remained still, arms crossed in quiet amusement up until this point, straightened. Calloway leaned forward slightly, his frown deepening. Elaborate. Sterling hesitated, his mind racing for a way to spin this, but there wasn't one. He was cornered. The defendant, Miss Carter, is not who we were led to believe she was. According to these documents, she is an active federal agent. The words landed like a gunshot. The courtroom reacted instantly. Gasps. Disbelief. A rush of voices colliding all at once. Even Calloway, who rarely showed anything beyond impatience, looked momentarily stunned before his face hardened again. He banged his gavel 3 times, calling for order, but the energy in the room had shifted. Sterling's hands shook as he flipped through more pages. She is a high-ranking operative for the CIA's Internal Investigations Unit. She has high-level clearance and direct oversight of counterintelligence cases that involve domestic law enforcement. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man who had spent most of the trial looking disinterested, sat up straighter, alarm flickering across his face. What does that even mean? Aaliyah finally spoke. Her voice was calm, even, but it carried an authority that was impossible to ignore. It means I investigate law enforcement corruption on a federal level. A pin could have dropped. Judge Calloway's face twitched. This must be some mistake. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. Does it look like a mistake, Your Honor? Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted toward Sterling, seeking something, anything, that could refute what had just been said. Sterling's expression was tight, his mind visibly racing, trying to control the fallout. Why, he started, voice low, strained, would a federal investigator be in possession of stolen property? Aaliyah leaned back in her chair slightly, exhaling as if she had been waiting for that exact question. I wasn't. A beat of silence. Sterling scoffed, trying to regain some footing. The footage was fabricated. The entire courtroom felt like it stopped breathing. Aaliyah turned her gaze to the officer standing near the back, her eyes sharp. You didn't think I'd check. You didn't think I'd verify timestamps, metadata, surveillance discrepancies. You've been operating under the assumption that I was just another woman you could throw into the system, but what you failed to consider, what you never considered, was that I already knew you before you even knew my name. Sterling's face darkened. That's a ridiculous accusation. Aaliyah's smile didn't reach her eyes. Is it? She nodded toward the folder still in his grip. Keep reading. Sterling hesitated, then flipped to the next section. His face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Calloway's impatience cracked. What? What the hell does it say? Sterling's voice came out quieter now. There's an ongoing federal investigation into multiple members of law enforcement in Montgomery, including officers directly involved in this case. He swallowed hard. The charges include falsification of evidence, witness coercion, obstruction of justice, and racially motivated misconduct. A woman in the front row let out an audible gasp. A few jury members stiffened. The officers near the back shifted slightly, their eyes flicking between one another. Judge Calloway's hand trembled as he gripped his gavel. This is absurd. Aaliyah's expression remained steady, but her next words were spoken deliberately. No, what's absurd is how comfortable all of you have become with the idea that you'll never face consequences. Sterling took a step back, his mind scrambling, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of what had just unfolded. This doesn't change the fact that you were arrested under suspicion, Aaliyah interrupted smoothly. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, when was the last time you vetted your own officers? He blinked. Excuse me. Aaliyah exhaled. Because I have. And what I found is enough to bring this entire courtroom down. A slow, creeping fear entered Sterling's eyes. This is a bluff. Aaliyah leaned forward slightly. If you really believe that, then let's proceed. Let's bring in the press, release the documents, and see who the public believes. You, or the truth. Sterling hesitated. His fingers flexed against the papers in his hand. Judge Calloway's face had gone pale, sweat gathering at his temple. The officers at the back had stopped moving altogether, their expressions unreadable. Aaliyah inhaled slowly, then let the final blow land. I have everything. Another ripple went through the room. The word settled. Sank. Took root. And for the first time, the people in power looked afraid. Sterling's grip on the documents tightened, his pulse visible at the base of his throat. He knew this wasn't just a shift in the case, this was an implosion. Everything he had walked into this courtroom believing, every assumption, every carefully calculated move, had just been torn apart. And the worst part? He could feel it, feel the entire room beginning to turn against him. Judge Calloway's voice was strained, as if he was fighting to maintain some semblance of control. Ms. Carter, you are making serious accusations against law enforcement officials and this very court. If you are lying, this will result in immediate perjury charges. Aaliyah didn't even blink. Then charge me. The room went completely still. Even Sterling's breath hitched slightly. She leaned back in her chair, unbothered. You've had no issue throwing baseless charges at me all morning. So do it. Call in your marshals, your security. Add another felony to my record. But before you do, she tilted her head slightly, voice unwavering. Ask yourself why I would sit here, in front of all these people, in your courtroom, and say this if I wasn't absolutely certain of what I had. Sterling's lips parted, but he said nothing. Aaliyah continued, her voice steady, surgical. I was never meant to be on trial today. But the people who are. They're in this room. Watching. Listening. Realizing they've been compromised. One of the officers standing near the back shifted, his jaw tightening. His nameplate read T. Murdoch, and his face was slightly paler than it had been 5 minutes ago. Aaliyah's gaze flicked to him for half a second, just enough for him to know she saw him, before she turned back to Sterling. Sterling exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous. None of this explains why you were caught with stolen property, Aaliyah cut him off. Because I wasn't. The evidence was planted, and you know it. Sterling scoffed, shaking his head. We have surveillance footage, Aaliyah's eyes darkened. No. You have altered surveillance footage. But what you don't know, Mr. Sterling, is that I have the original. A visible reaction. Not just from Sterling, but from the officers in the room. Aaliyah let the words settle before she continued. I accessed the database before you could cover your tracks. The original footage shows exactly what happened that night. It shows your officers fabricating this case from the ground up. It shows who tampered with the logs. Who manipulated the timestamps. Who wrote the reports. A cold sweat broke across Sterling's brow. He turned slightly toward the judge, desperate now. Your Honor, this is clearly a tactic to derail the case, she's trying to intimidate the court, Aaliyah exhaled. If I wanted to intimidate you, I'd tell you what else I found. Sterling froze. The entire courtroom, for the first time, felt off balance. Aaliyah folded her hands on the table. Your Honor, I request that this court recess immediately to allow my legal counsel to present classified evidence in a federal capacity. Calloway looked livid. This is not a federal trial, Ms. Carter. It wasn't, she said simply, until you put me on trial. Sterling could feel the walls closing in. His throat tightened. Your Honor, you can't seriously be considering this. You can't let her dictate. Aaliyah's voice was calm but firm. I don't have to dictate anything. The moment I was put on that witness stand under false charges, this case became a federal matter. Judge Calloway's face was unreadable, but the gavel in his grip trembled just slightly. Sterling saw it. He saw all of it. The unraveling. The shift in power. And then it hit him. They weren't in control anymore. Aaliyah Carter had played them. Sterling's chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands clenching at his sides. He turned back toward the officers in the courtroom, desperate for any sign of backup. But something was wrong. They weren't looking at him. They were looking past him. He frowned, turning slowly, just in time to see the doors of the courtroom swing open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence immediate, their posture sharp, authoritative. A few people in the gallery gasped. One of the officers, Murdoch, took an instinctive step back. Judge Calloway's face went from anger to something else entirely. "Who the hell are you?" One of the men reached into his jacket, producing a leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a federal badge. The courtroom descended into chaos. Sterling took a step forward, his mouth opening to object, but his voice failed him. The weight of realization hit him in waves, the pieces coming together too fast to stop. Aaliyah Carter wasn't bluffing. She had already called them in. This wasn't a case anymore. This was an operation. Sterling turned back to her, his face contorted in disbelief, in anger, in fear. "You," Aaliyah exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She finally stood, her hands still cuffed in front of her. Her voice, even now, was steady. "I told you," she murmured, her eyes never leaving his. "You never knew who you were dealing with." A wave of movement erupted behind her as the federal agents advanced toward the judge's bench. The courtroom erupted into chaos, people whispering, reporters scrambling to capture the moment, jury members visibly panicking. One of the federal agents, a man with a clipped tone and sharp posture, addressed the judge. "Your Honor, as of this moment, this trial is no longer under your jurisdiction." Calloway's face flushed with fury. "This is my courtroom, you don't get to just, this is a federal case now," the agent interrupted, his voice like steel. He turned toward Aaliyah. "We have jurisdiction." The second agent produced a stack of documents, handing them directly to the clerk. "We are moving forward with the arrest of multiple individuals involved in an ongoing corruption case. Judge Calloway, Mark Sterling, Officer Murdoch," he listed off more names. Names of officers. Names of officials. Names of people in this very room. People began shifting in their seats. Some officers moved for the exits, too late. More agents stepped in, cutting off any chance of escape. Sterling's breath was rapid, his body locked in place. This is insane." Aaliyah turned fully toward him now, her expression still calm, still collected. "What's insane," she murmured, "is how long you all thought you could get away with this." Sterling's pulse thundered in his ears. He looked at Calloway, expecting the judge to intervene, to stop this, but for the first time, Calloway looked small. Helpless. He wasn't in charge anymore. None of them were. One of the agents stepped forward. "Mark Sterling, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsification of evidence, and conspiracy to defraud the legal system." The courtroom exploded in noise. Gasps. Shouts. Sterling flinched as cold steel wrapped around his wrists. The same cuffs he had seen on Aaliyah. And then he understood. She had known. The whole time, she had known. Aaliyah met his gaze as they hauled him forward, her voice even. Unshaken. "The difference between you and me," she said softly, just for him to hear. "I knew how this would end." The weight of the moment lingered in the air long after the chaos had settled. The courtroom, once filled with the smug certainty of men who believed themselves untouchable, now stood in stunned silence. The seats where officers had sat, chests puffed with false confidence, were now empty, their former occupants led away in cuffs. Reporters scrambled to rewrite their narratives, their pens furiously scratching against their notepads as they tried to capture the seismic shift that had just unfolded before their eyes. Aaliyah Carter remained standing, her wrists still bound, but the power dynamic in the room had irreversibly changed. The gavel that had once been a symbol of unchecked authority now sat useless on the judge's desk, untouched. Calloway himself had barely moved since the federal agents took control, his once pristine robe feeling heavier by the second as reality settled onto his shoulders. His hands, which had so confidently signed off on cases just like this one, now shook slightly where they rested against his desk. Sterling was gone. Hauled out first, his protests growing weaker with every step he was forced to take. The jury, who had been so quick to judge her minutes ago, now sat motionless, their expressions ranging from shock to unease, some shifting uncomfortably as if they could already feel the world outside these walls turning against them. Aaliyah's gaze moved slowly over the room, taking in the aftermath. The ones who had laughed earlier, who had exchanged smirks and side glances as they waited for her to crumble, now refused to meet her eyes. She exhaled, steadying herself, because this wasn't over. Not yet. One of the agents, the taller of the two who had entered first, approached her, his tone professional but carrying an undertone of something else, respect. "Agent Carter," he said, the title now carrying the weight it was always meant to. "Let's get those off you." The metal cuffs around her wrists clicked open, the sting of their pressure still imprinted on her skin. She rolled her wrists slightly, not in pain but in acknowledgement, a silent reminder of what had nearly happened here, of what had been intended for her. The room remained frozen as she lowered her hands, the sound of the cuffs being tucked away the only thing breaking the hush. She finally turned toward Judge Calloway. The man who had ruled over this courtroom for decades, deciding the fates of people just like her without hesitation, without concern. Now, he sat stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line, his mind undoubtedly racing through ways to salvage whatever was left of his crumbling authority. Aaliyah let the silence stretch, knowing the weight of it was heavier than any words she could say. Then, when she finally spoke, her voice was calm but deliberate. "This courtroom is supposed to serve justice. That was never what happened here." Calloway's fingers twitched, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Aaliyah continued. "How many people sat where I did, knowing they were innocent? How many times did you make a decision before the trial even started?" The judge opened his mouth, but whatever defense he was about to give died in his throat. Because what could he say? That she was wrong. That this was an exception. Everyone in the room knew better. Aaliyah let the truth settle over him before shifting her gaze toward the jury, the people who had so easily accepted the prosecution's lies without question. "How many of you were ready to convict me just because someone in a suit told you to? How many of you didn't even consider that I might be innocent?" A few of them flinched. Some looked down at their hands. One woman in the back swallowed hard, guilt flickering across her face. She turned toward the section of the courtroom where the officers had stood, where Sterling had presented his airtight case with a confidence that had now shattered. "You all thought I was powerless," she said, her voice carrying through the space. "And that's exactly why you got comfortable. That's why you thought you could get away with it." A heavy pause. She exhaled. "You all thought this was a game." Her eyes returned to Calloway. "Do you think that now?" The judge's throat worked as he finally found his voice, though it was weaker than before. "Agent Carter." She tilted her head slightly, waiting. But no explanation came. Because there wasn't one. One of the federal agents stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "As of this moment, Judge Calloway, you are under federal review for misconduct and judicial bias in multiple cases. A formal investigation will be conducted, and you will be required to appear before the appropriate authorities." Calloway inhaled sharply, his knuckles turning white against the desk. "You have no right," "You had no right," the agent interrupted smoothly. "And yet," here we are. Calloway's breath came sharp and fast now, his world tilting in a way he had never experienced before. Aaliyah didn't need to hear the rest. She knew what was coming next. The investigations. The uncovering of every case like hers that had been buried under false evidence and systemic corruption. The fallout that would ripple beyond this courtroom, beyond this city. This wasn't just a single case. This was the beginning of something much bigger. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight lift from her chest. Not because this was over. But because it had finally begun. The reporters had finally found their voices again, their whispers turning into rapid murmurs, their hands flying across their notepads as they tried to capture what had just happened. The camera lenses zoomed in, trying to immortalize the downfall of those who had ruled unchecked for far too long. Aaliyah turned, walking past the defense table, past the jury, past the rows of seats filled with faces that had once judged her and now watched her with something closer to awe. She reached the courtroom doors, the same ones she had walked through in chains, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. But just as she reached for the handle, a voice called from behind her. Aaliyah. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. It was one of the jurors. The woman who had flinched earlier, the one whose hands had trembled when the truth had begun to unfold. She looked shaken, her eyes searching for something, maybe absolution, maybe understanding. Aaliyah held her gaze for a moment. Yes. The woman hesitated, then asked, voice quiet but loaded with weight. How many times do you think this has happened before? Aaliyah's breath stilled. The answer sat at the edge of her lips, heavy and unrelenting. Too many. But instead of saying it, she just nodded once, slow and certain, before turning back toward the doors. And then, she walked out. The hallway stretched long and sterile, bathed in the harsh glow of overhead fluorescent lights that flickered faintly, as if uncertain whether they wanted to stay on or give in to the darkness that clung to the edges of this place. The polished floors reflected distorted images of the people moving through them, blurred figures passing by like ghosts in a space that had held countless whispered confessions, silent fears, and shattered hopes. The echoes of footsteps filled the air, mixing with the muffled sounds of the chaos still unraveling inside the courtroom. Aaliyah Carter stood motionless in the center of it all, her breathing slow, measured, controlled, as if every inhale and exhale was a calculated act, a deliberate reclaiming of the power they had tried to strip from her. The cool air-conditioned chill of the building settled against her skin, a stark contrast to the heat still simmering in her veins from the firestorm she had just ignited. She had known this would happen, had known exactly how they would react, how they would scramble the moment the truth tore through the carefully constructed lie they had built around her. Behind her, the thick wooden doors of the courtroom remained shut, but she could still hear everything. The agitated voices of attorneys arguing in frantic whispers, the rapid-fire questions from reporters demanding statements from anyone who dared to step outside, the low murmur of the jury, still seated inside, still grappling with the uncomfortable truth they had been forced to confront. She imagined Calloway sitting there, hands clenched tightly against his desk, jaw tight, his mind racing through every possible way to regain control, to salvage even a shred of authority in a room where his word no longer carried weight. She imagined Sterling, red-faced and seething, locked in a holding room somewhere, replaying every moment that had led to his downfall, trying to convince himself that there had been something he could have done differently, something that would have allowed him to win. But there had never been a path to victory for him. Not today. She shifted slightly, rolling her wrists now that the cuffs were gone, flexing her fingers as the phantom pressure of steel still burned against her skin. The pain was dull but present, a reminder of how close she had come to being another name lost in the system, another case buried under the weight of corruption disguised as justice. But she wasn't just another case. She never had been. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts, and she didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The presence behind her was steady, familiar in its quiet authority. Henderson. He stopped just beside her, standing close but not too close, giving her space but making it clear that he was there, watching, analyzing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his dark suit, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, trained on her like he was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, and realizing that whatever assumptions he had walked into that courtroom with had been completely shattered. "You planned this," he finally said, his voice low, not accusing, but acknowledging. Aaliyah didn't look at him immediately, letting the words settle between them before tilting her head slightly in his direction, a faint smirk playing at the edges of her lips. "Planned is a strong word." Henderson let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head, his gaze flicking toward the closed courtroom doors before returning to her. "You let them think they had control. You sat there and let them build their case, let them parade around like they had already won, all while you were waiting for the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under them." He exhaled through his nose, a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration tightening his jaw. "That's not luck. That's strategy." Aaliyah finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable but the sharpness in her eyes unmistakable. "They were too comfortable," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of experience, of knowing. "That's always their mistake. They never think to question the system because the system has always worked for them. They assume they're untouchable. That's why they never saw this coming." Henderson studied her for a moment longer before shaking his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You took a risk," he muttered, his tone dipping into something close to concern, though he masked it well. "You were in there alone." If that file hadn't come through in time, Aaliyah cut him off with a slow exhale, her voice unwavering. "But it did." Henderson held her gaze for another second before nodding, as if conceding that there was no point in arguing with a woman who had just turned an entire trial on its head with nothing but the truth and impeccable timing. The heavy metal doors at the far end of the hallway swung open, and another agent stepped out, his radio clipped to his vest crackling faintly as he made his way toward them. His expression was tense but focused, his movements brisk, efficient, the kind of person who always had a dozen thoughts running through his head at once but never let them show. "Carter," he said, addressing her directly, with the kind of professionalism that made it clear he had known exactly who she was long before today. "Sterling's in holding. Calloway's trying to call in favors, but legally, he's backed into a corner. Murdoch and the others are being processed now. It's unraveling the way you said it would." Aaliyah absorbed the information without reaction, her expression cool, calculated. "And the jury?" The agent exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Some are shaken. Others are just in shock. They weren't expecting this. None of them were." Aaliyah smirked faintly, the corners of her lips barely lifting. "Neither was Sterling." Henderson tilted his head slightly, regarding her. "And now?" She inhaled slowly, as if centering herself, before rolling her shoulders back. "Now, we find out how deep this goes." The second agent hesitated for just a second before speaking again, this time with a note of something more personal in his voice. "And you? After all this, what do you want to do?" Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, considering the question, but before she could answer, a voice cut through the hallway. "Aaliyah." She turned, her gaze landing on Jacqueline Pierce, the defense attorney who had spent the better part of the last decade fighting against a system that seemed determined to break people like them. Her heels clicked against the tile as she approached, her face unreadable, though something flickered behind her dark eyes, something close to admiration, something deeper than just professional interest. "You really do know how to put on a show," Jacqueline said, stopping just a few feet away. "But let me guess, you weren't just performing, were you?" Aaliyah studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. "You already know the answer to that." Jacqueline nodded, smirking faintly. "I do. But I also know this city isn't ready for what you just did." Aaliyah's gaze didn't waver. "Then they better start preparing." Jacqueline let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "They won't have a choice." The second agent glanced between them before shifting his stance slightly. Ms. Pierce, with all due respect, this is still an active case. Jacqueline held up a hand, cutting him off smoothly. Relax. I'm not here to interfere. She met Aaliyah's gaze again, her voice dipping slightly. I just wanted to tell you something. Aaliyah lifted her chin slightly. What's that? Jacqueline's expression softened, just a fraction, but her words carried their full weight. You just changed everything. Aaliyah let out a slow breath, steady, certain. Good. And then, without another word, she walked away. The hallway stretched infinitely before her, lined with polished floors that reflected the overhead fluorescent lights in a sterile, artificial glow. The air inside the courthouse was thick, heavy with the residue of everything that had just transpired, filled with the weight of shattered illusions and the crumbling remnants of a system that had operated without resistance for far too long. The voices from inside the courtroom still echoed in the distance, muffled yet persistent, carrying the frantic energy of those trying to regain their footing after the ground had been ripped out from under them. She could hear the murmurs of the jury, still processing the fact that they had almost condemned an innocent woman, not because the evidence had pointed them there, but because the system had led them by the hand, guiding them to a conclusion that had been predetermined long before she ever sat in that defendant's chair. She could hear the agitated whispers of court officials scrambling to figure out how this had happened, how they had lost control so suddenly, so completely, and the occasional burst of a reporter's voice, trying to make sense of a story that had gone from an open-and-shut case to a full-blown federal scandal. Aaliyah Carter walked forward, her step steady, deliberate, her mind already working ahead, not on what had just happened, but on what came next. The battle inside that courtroom had been won, but the war was far from over. The people she had exposed today, the ones whose names were now being whispered in frantic, fearful voices, they weren't going to sit back and let this stand. They would fight back, clawing at whatever power they had left, using every connection, every favor, every loophole, to try and undo what she had done. But it was too late. The moment Sterling had been led away in handcuffs, the moment Calloway's face had drained of all color as the weight of the investigation crashed down on him, the moment the officers in the back of the room had shifted uncomfortably, realizing that for the first time in their lives, they weren't the ones holding the power, that was the moment everything changed. Footsteps approached behind her, measured, steady, a presence that wasn't unwelcome but carried with it the weight of an unspoken conversation. Henderson fell into step beside her, his usual easy confidence replaced with something more cautious, more deliberate. He was watching her, really watching her, his eyes scanning her face like he was trying to understand what kind of person could walk into a courtroom as a defendant and walk out leaving an entire institution in ruins. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his dark suit, his body language relaxed, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the thoughts running through his head. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Neither did she. They just walked, the hallway stretching endlessly before them, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them both in very different ways. Finally, he let out a breath, shaking his head, his voice laced with something between disbelief and admiration. You do realize you just burned an entire system to the ground in less than an hour, right? His words weren't accusatory, but there was a layer of something else beneath them, concern, maybe even awe. Aaliyah didn't slow her steps, didn't even look at him as she responded, her voice calm, steady, unshaken. No, Henderson. I didn't burn it down. I just lit the match. The system was already rotting from the inside out. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed under its own weight. Henderson let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it, just the sharp edge of realization that she was right. Yeah, well, you might want to start watching your back. You just made a lot of powerful people very, very uncomfortable. Aaliyah finally turned her head, glancing at him with something close to amusement. You think I don't know that? He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Jesus, Carter. I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Aaliyah smirked faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Try both. Before Henderson could respond, another voice cut through the air, low and controlled but carrying an undeniable authority. the kind of presence that demanded attention without needing to raise a single decibel. Aaliyah. She turned slowly, already knowing who it was before her eyes landed on Director Jonathan Reese, standing a few feet away, his suit immaculate, his stance firm, his face unreadable. Reese had been watching her career for years, tracking her rise, observing her as she took on cases that no one else could solve, watching her navigate a system designed to keep people like her out. He had always respected her. But now, there was something else in his expression, something rare. He was concerned. She straightened slightly, meeting his gaze head-on, unflinching. Director. Reese took a step closer, his voice measured, deliberate. Walk with me. She didn't hesitate, falling into step beside him, Henderson trailing a few steps behind, his presence lingering but silent. The hallway stretched before them, leading toward the exit, toward the world that was already waiting outside, already reacting to what had just happened. For a long moment, Reese said nothing, and Aaliyah didn't break the silence. She knew him well enough to know that when he spoke, every word would be precise, weighted, intentional. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Reese let out a slow breath, his voice quieter now, as if he were measuring every word before letting it leave his lips. You just turned a legal proceeding into a national scandal. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in irritation, but in certainty. I just exposed the truth. Reese nodded once, acknowledging the point but not relenting. The truth doesn't always set people free. Sometimes, it just makes them more dangerous. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. Are you warning me? Reese held her stare, his voice steady. I'm telling you what you already know. There are people in this city, in this government, who thrive on control. And right now, they're realizing they just lost a lot of it. Aaliyah didn't waver. Let them squirm. Reese sighed, running a hand down the front of his suit, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle, a tick of control in a situation where he had very little. You've been untouchable for a long time, Carter. But you just made enemies who don't play fair. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. They never did. Reese studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to push further, but finally, he nodded slightly, conceding. He had always known she was relentless. But now? Now, she was unstoppable. They reached the exit doors, where the sunlight poured through the glass panes, illuminating the outside world that had been waiting for her, waiting for this moment. The steps were flooded with reporters, their microphones extended, their cameras flashing, voices colliding as they shouted her name, demanding answers, demanding a story. Aaliyah turned to Reese one last time, her voice steady, calm, but unshaken. Let them come. Let them try. But the difference now? She exhaled slowly, feeling the shift, feeling the power that had been stolen from her finally returned. This time, I'm not alone. And then, without another word, she pushed open the doors and stepped outside. The sun had begun to set over Montgomery, casting long shadows across the city as the world outside adjusted to the fallout of everything that had unraveled in the courthouse. The weight of the scandal had spread like wildfire, reaching far beyond the city limits, igniting conversations in newsrooms, political offices, and law enforcement agencies across the country. What had started as a single case had become a reckoning, a moment in history where the very foundation of a corrupt system had been cracked open for everyone to see. Aaliyah Carter stood in the center of it all, but unlike before, she wasn't standing alone. The press was relentless, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward her, voices clashing as reporters demanded statements. Some were searching for an angle, for a way to spin what had happened, while others simply wanted to hear her say the words that had been sitting on the tip of everyone's tongues, that the system had never been fair, that justice had never been blind, that for far too long, power had belonged only to those who could manipulate it. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. Her voice was clear, firm, unapologetic. For years, people like me have been told to trust a system that was never designed to protect us. We've been told to stay quiet, to let the process work, to wait our turn for justice. But today, that changes. Today, the truth speaks louder than the lies, and no matter how many times they try to rewrite the story, the facts remain the same. The reporters threw more questions at her, but she didn't need to say anything else. The world had already seen what it needed to see. They had watched a judge stripped of his authority, a prosecutor exposed as a fraud, officers who had once walked with unchecked power now led away in handcuffs. The people who had stood so confidently against her, who had believed that their influence could shield them, were now on the other side of the law, facing the consequences they had spent years avoiding. Mark Sterling sat in a holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hands clasped together as he stared at the walls, waiting for a way out that wasn't coming. His career was over, his reputation shattered. He had spent his life winning cases, bending the law in his favor, making a name for himself as the prosecutor who never lost. But he had lost now. And worse than that, he had lost to a woman he had underestimated from the very beginning. Judge Calloway had resigned within hours of leaving the courthouse, but resigning wouldn't save him from the investigation that was already underway. His name was being tied to dozens of cases that were now being reopened, cases where justice had been denied, where verdicts had been bought, where lives had been destroyed by a man who had never seen the people in his courtroom as human beings, only as obstacles to remove, names to erase. His legacy, once untouchable, had turned to dust. The officers involved in the falsification of evidence had been suspended pending their own trials, the very system they had once manipulated now turning against them. They sat in interrogation rooms, their hands folded, their expressions blank, as they were questioned by people who no longer worked to protect them. They had spent their careers planting stories, twisting facts, making sure that people like Aaliyah never got to tell their side. But now, the cameras were on them, the microphones picking up their stammered denials, their weak excuses. And Aaliyah? She walked away free. But more than that, she walked away victorious. She had stepped into a courtroom as a woman falsely accused, a woman meant to be silenced, buried beneath the weight of a rigged system. And she had walked out as something much bigger. She had become the one thing they feared the most, a black woman with power, with truth, and with nothing left to lose. Henderson caught up to her as she stepped off the courthouse steps, his face still lined with disbelief, but beneath it, there was something else. Respect. So what now, Carter? You just took down half the justice system in one day. What's next? She glanced at him, the smallest smirk tugging at her lips. Now we see how many more walls we can bring down. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, the system wasn't just looking at her. It was afraid of her. Now, let's talk about this. How many times has history repeated itself? How many times have people been silenced, their truth buried under a system designed to never hear them? How many people have sat in courtrooms, just like Aaliyah, knowing they were innocent but realizing that innocence wasn't enough? Today, we saw the system shaken, but this is not just fiction. This is reality for so many people. This is what happens when power is unchecked, when corruption is left to thrive. But what happens when people start to fight back? What happens when the truth refuses to be silenced? Tell me, what do you think would have happened if Aaliyah had been just another woman with no way to defend herself? If she hadn't had the resources, the intelligence, the proof to expose them? And how many others have sat in her place, without those tools, with no way to turn the game around? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in her position. Tell me what you think should happen to every single person who was part of this corruption. Let's talk about it, because these stories, they aren't just stories. They are warnings. They are truths disguised as fiction. They are reality. And if you want to hear more stories that challenge the system, that flip the script, that expose what's hidden beneath the surface, then make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because here, the truth always wins.